In 46 BC, a Roman dictator marched an animal through his own triumph that not one person in the city had ever seen. It walked taller than the arches it passed beneath. It had the face of a camel and the coat of a leopard, and the crowd could not settle on whether it was a single creature or two of them stitched together by someone with an unusual sense of humor. They named it a camelopard, wrote it down, and then had absolutely no idea what to do with it. That was not the first time it happened. It was nowhere close to the last. For roughly 2,000 years, human beings have been dragging giraffes across oceans, deserts, and mountain passes. Nubian rulers sent them north as tribute to Egyptian courts, walking them up the Nile as living proof of what the south could produce. A Chinese treasure fleet carried one home across the Indian Ocean and presented it to an emperor whose scholars read it as a creature from heaven, arriving to confirm that his rule was blessed. A Florentine banking family paraded one through their own streets to impress a pope and to remind their rivals what money could reach. Not one of those journeys had a practical purpose. Not one of them was about food, labor, warfare, or trade in anything but prestige. Because we never domesticated this animal. We never put it to work. It does not pull a plow or guard a gate. It does not carry a rider, herd a flock, hunt alongside us, or sleep at the foot of anybody's bed. No other species on Earth carries that record. We have moved the giraffe further, more often, at greater cost, for less reason, than anything else we have ever encountered. The giraffe is the tallest living land animal, and it is not a close contest. A full-grown male stands somewhere between 5.5 and 6 meters, roughly a 2-story building, or a basketball hoop stacked twice. Females run shorter, around 4.5 meters, which means in a mixed herd you can sex an adult from a distance on height alone, before you register anything else about it. A large bull weighs in the region of 1,200 kilograms, a cow closer to 830. That is a horse and a half of animal, balanced on legs that look borrowed from something else entirely. Those legs run about 1.80 meters apiece. The front pair is slightly longer than the back, which is why a standing giraffe always looks like it is walking gently downhill, even when it is motionless. At the bottom of each is a hoof, roughly 30 centimeters across, a dinner plate, and it has to be, because everything above it is pressing down. The neck is the part everyone came for. It runs around 2 meters and weighs somewhere near 250 kilograms. On its own, disconnected from the rest of the animal, it outweighs you and everyone you have ever shared a lift with. And it contains 7 vertebrae. 7. Reach up and touch the back of your own neck right now. You have 7 too. So does a mouse. So does a blue whale. The giraffe did not add bones to get where it got. It stretched the ones it already had, until single vertebrae reached 25 centimeters apiece, each one longer than your forearm. There is a wrinkle in that rule, and it is a good one. The first vertebra of the giraffe's chest does not behave much like a chest bone. It pivots and articulates in a way that hands the neck extra reach and extra flexibility, functioning as something close to an 8th neck bone without technically being one. Evolution did not break the mammalian 7. It found the loophole. Holding all of that up requires the nuchal ligament, a band of elastic tissue running from the back of the skull down along the spine. In a giraffe, it is thick, powerful, and enormous. Less a ligament than a suspension cable. The animal is not straining to keep its head aloft. The head is held by stored tension it never has to think about, the way a drawbridge is held by counterweight rather than effort. Anchoring the whole system is a hump of muscle and elongated spines at the shoulder, which is why the giraffe's back slopes so sharply. That slope is not styling, it is structural engineering, visible from the outside. Now go inside, because the outside is the easy part. The heart is around 11 kilograms and about 60 centimeters long, but it is not oversized in the way you would expect for an animal that size. What makes it remarkable is the wall of the left ventricle, which is extraordinarily thick, several centimeters of dense muscle wrapped around a comparatively narrow chamber. This is not a bigger pump, it is a higher pressure one, built the way a fire hose is built rather than a bucket. It needs to be. Giraffe blood pressure sits at roughly double yours, with readings in the region of 280 over 180 considered ordinary. In a human being, that number is a medical emergency, the kind that ends with an ambulance. In a giraffe, it is a Tuesday, And it has to be that high, because blood must be driven vertically up 2 meters of neck, against gravity, to reach a brain parked at the top of it. Drop the pressure by half, and the animal loses consciousness, standing perfectly still. Which creates the obvious problem, and you have already thought of it. What happens when the head comes down to drink? All of that pressure suddenly pointing downhill, aimed directly into the skull. The answer sits at the base of the brain, a dense mesh of small arteries called the rete mirabile, the wonderful net. Blood entering it slows, spreads, and loses its force before it ever reaches brain tissue. The surge is broken every single time the head goes down, hundreds of times a day, without fail. On the way back up, valves in the jugular veins stop blood draining backwards out of the head. The system is guarded in both directions, and neither guard is optional. Then there is the bottom of the animal, which has the reverse problem. At ground level, in a body running that kind of pressure, fluid should be forced straight out of the capillaries and into the surrounding tissue. The legs should swell like water balloons. They do not, because the skin of the lower leg is unusually thick and drawn extraordinarily tight, a natural compression garment, holding fluid exactly where it belongs. Aerospace researchers have studied that mechanism directly in the context of pressure suit design, for the straightforward reason that engineers examine anything that has already solved the problem they are working on. Breathing is its own puzzle. Lung capacity runs to something around 55 liters, several times a human's, and it needs to, because the windpipe is close to 2 meters long. Every breath must first push through all that dead air before a single molecule of fresh oxygen reaches the lungs. So the giraffe breathes slowly and hugely, around 8 to 10 breaths a minute at rest, each one deep and unhurried. Moving through it all is blood carrying unusually small red cells packed at high density, which slip more easily through the narrow vessels of a high-pressure system and haul oxygen efficiently across very long distances. Come back to the surface. The eye is around 5 centimeters across, among the largest of any land mammal, set high and set wide for near panoramic vision. From full height, a giraffe spots movement across open savanna long before a predator is anywhere near useful range, and every other species out there knows it. Zebra and antelope routinely graze near giraffes and take their cue from where the tall heads are pointing. The giraffe is the watchtower of the ecosystem, and it did not volunteer for the job. Feeding takes up most of the day. Giraffes are ruminants, 4-chambered stomach, cud, the entire arrangement, which means that several times daily, a bolus of half-digested acacia is sent back up 2 meters of esophagus to be chewed a second time and swallowed again. You can watch it travel. It moves up the neck as a visible lump, like something climbing a rope. An adult puts away somewhere between 30 and 45 kilograms of foliage a day and can spend 16 to 20 hours getting it down. The coat is not decoration. Every giraffe's pattern is unique to the individual, and it is heritable. Research on Maasai giraffes has shown calves inherit measurable traits of spot shape and roundness from their mothers, and that certain patterns correlate with better survival odds in the vulnerable first months of life. Underneath each dark patch runs a network of blood vessels. The patches function as thermal windows, releasing heat outward through the skin, which is part of how a 2-story animal stands in full equatorial sun all day without shade and does not cook. The horns on top are not horns, they are ossicones, cartilage that ossifies into bone and fuses to the skull, and giraffes are born with them already present, folded flat against the head so they do not injure the mother on the way out, springing upright within days of birth. You can sex an adult by them. Females keep a tuft of hair on top, while males wear theirs bald, rubbed clean by decades of hitting each other with their faces. And the male skull never stops growing. It keeps depositing calcium throughout life, thickening year on year, until an old bull carries a head weighing well over 10 kilograms. A club that gets heavier the longer he survives. Which leaves the part of the giraffe that does the actual work, and the part almost nobody looks at. The tongue is 45 to 50 centimeters long, prehensile, muscular, and dexterous enough to strip leaves from between the thorns of an acacia without the animal ever closing its mouth on the branch. It is armored with tough papillae and coated in exceptionally thick saliva that seals over whatever punctures the thorns manage to land. And it is dark, deep blue-black at the tip, fading to pink where it sits back inside the mouth. The leading explanation is sunburn. That tongue is out in the open, in direct equatorial light, for the better part of 20 hours a day. The pigment stops almost exactly where the sunlight stops reaching. Giraffes move with a gait almost nothing else its size uses. Both legs on the same side, swing forward together, then both legs on the other, a pace rather than a trot. It is the only way to move those limbs without the front and back on the same side colliding. At a walk it looks unhurried, almost lazy. At full speed it changes entirely. The animal shifts into a rocking gallop, neck swinging forward and back with every stride, to shift its center of mass, and it can hold something close to 60 kilometers an hour in a short burst. Not for long, but long enough. And if running is not an option, the alternative is worse, for whatever forced the issue. A giraffe's kick can shatter a lion's skull. Lions do take giraffes, regularly, but they overwhelmingly take calves, and they do it with a numbers advantage and a great deal of caution. A healthy adult standing its ground on open, flat terrain is a genuinely unattractive proposition for a predator, and predators know how to count risk, which is exactly why drinking is the most dangerous thing a giraffe does. To reach water, it has to splay its front legs wide apart, or bend them at the knee, and lower its head almost to ground level. It is the one moment in the animal's entire day when it is slow, blind to its flanks, and physically committed. Recovery from that position takes several seconds. Several seconds it does not have. So giraffes approach water tense, drink in short bursts, and lift their heads constantly to scan. They also, mercifully, do not need to do it often. Most of their water comes from the leaves themselves, and a giraffe can go days at a stretch without drinking at all. In cooler seasons, some go considerably longer. Feeding shapes almost everything else. Bulls and cows browse at different heights on the same tree. Males stretching upward at full extension, females feeding lower with the neck horizontal or angled down. On a single acacia, the sexes are effectively eating in different rooms, which cuts competition in half without either party negotiating. Their browsing also prunes the tree, and across the savanna, giraffes measurably shape the canopy line, keeping certain species trimmed to a shape you can read from a distance. The trees, for their part, fight back. Acacias respond to heavy browsing by flooding their leaves with tannins that turn the meal bitter and harder to digest, and there is good evidence that damaged trees release volatile compounds that neighboring trees detect and respond to in kind. Giraffes appear to work around this. They browse a tree briefly, move on before the chemistry catches up, and there are observations of them moving upwind between trees, which would put them ahead of any airborne warning. Whether that is deliberate strategy or simple efficiency is still argued, but the pattern is there in the data. Then there is the strangest thing they eat, which is not a plant at all. Giraffes chew bones. They pick up dry carcass bones from the ground, tip their heads back, and roll them around in the mouth for long stretches. It is called osteophagy, and it is not a nutritional quirk of one odd individual. It is common, and it is almost certainly about minerals. Growing that much skeleton, and in males laying down calcium on the skull for a lifetime, requires phosphorus and calcium in quantities leaves alone struggle to supply. So the tallest herbivore on Earth periodically stops eating trees and stands there gnawing on a rib. Now the social side, which for a long time, everyone got wrong. Giraffes were written off for decades as essentially asocial, animals that drifted past each other in loose, meaningless aggregations with no structure worth studying. That conclusion came from the fact that giraffe herds are constantly dissolving and reforming. The composition of a group changes hour to hour. Watch for a day, and it looks like chaos. Watch for a decade, and it does not. Long-term studies tracking individuals by their spot patterns have shown that giraffes live in what is called a fission-fusion society, the same broad category as elephants, dolphins, and chimpanzees. Underneath the shifting surface, particular females associate with particular other females far more often than chance allows, and those preferences hold for years. They have friends. They also have adversaries they consistently avoid. The herd is not random. It only looks random on a short timescale, which is precisely how long humans watched it for. Females also share childcare. Calves are gathered into creches, while mothers browse in rotation, with adults taking turns supervising groups of young that are not their own. That arrangement lets a mother feed properly without leaving her calf exposed, and it is one of the reasons calves survive at all, because the raw numbers are brutal. Estimates for first-year mortality run enormously high, commonly cited in the range of 50 to 75%, depending on the population and the predator pressure. Most giraffes born do not reach their first birthday. Getting born is itself a violent introduction. Gestation runs around 15 months, and the mother gives birth standing up. The calf, already about 1 meter 80 tall and around 70 kilograms, falls close to 2 meters to the ground. It is not an accident of anatomy anyone has bothered to fix, because the impact appears to help. It snaps the umbilical cord, and the shock helps trigger the first breath. Within an hour, most calves are standing. Within a day, they can run. There is no other option available to them. Older females appear to matter beyond their own offspring. Research on wild populations has found that calf survival improves in groups containing older, experienced females, which points towards something like a grandmother effect, accumulated knowledge of where water sits in a bad year, which routes are safe, when to move. Giraffes can live around 25 years in the wild and considerably longer in captivity, with the oldest recorded individuals reaching around 40. That is a great deal of stored information walking around inside a herd that supposedly had no structure. Males live differently. They rarely settle into a group at all, instead roaming widely between herds, testing females as they pass. That testing is chemical. A bull nudges a cow until she urinates, tastes the stream, then lifts his head and curls back his upper lip in the Fleckman response, drawing the scent across a sensory organ in the roof of the mouth to read her reproductive state directly. If she is not ready, he leaves. It is efficient, unromantic, and it works. Rank between bulls is settled by necking. Two males stand shoulder to shoulder, brace their legs, swing their heads back on those 2 meters of neck, and club each other with the skull, that calcium-loaded head coming around like a wrecking ball on a cable. Blows land on the ribs, the flanks, the legs. The impact is audible from a considerable distance. Most contests are ritualized and end when one animal concedes, but they are not always harmless. Bulls have been knocked unconscious, and fatalities, while rare, are documented. The winner takes precedence with receptive females, and because the skull thickens with age, an older bull is carrying a heavier weapon than a younger one. In giraffe society, experience is literally bone. Start with the name, because the name records the confusion. Our word arrives through Italian and French from the Arabic zarafa, which traders carried north out of Africa along with the animal itself. But the older European name was the Roman one, and it was a compound, camel plus leopard. Two familiar things bolted together, because the thing in front of them had no category. That name held for well over 1,000 years across most of Europe. When a Flemish cartographer laid out a new constellation in 1612, drawing a long-necked shape into an empty patch of the northern sky, he called it Camelopardalis. It is still there, still called that, still faint enough that most people have never picked it out. The confusion outlived the Romans by a wide margin. When the great Swedish naturalist sat down to formally classify the world's species in 1758, he filed the giraffe as a kind of deer, Cervus camelopardalis. A deer. It took further decades of anatomy before the animal was granted a genus of its own, and even that arrived with the camel leopard buried inside the scientific name, where it remains today. 2,000 years on, the formal Latin for the tallest animal on Earth is still an admission that the first people to see one had no idea what they were looking at. The traffic itself began long before Rome. Egyptian records and tomb art show giraffes arriving from the south as tribute, walked up the Nile from Nubian territory alongside ebony, ivory, leopard skins and monkeys, as living evidence of how far a pharaoh's reach extended. A giraffe was a diplomatic statement in animal form. Whoever sent it was announcing access to places you could not go. The Egyptians even took the shape into their writing, where a giraffe glyph carried meanings connected to foretelling and to seeing at distance, which, for an animal that spots trouble first, is a reasonable read. Then the Middle Ages, and the strangest chapter of the whole story. In the early 1400s, a Chinese admiral commanded a treasure fleet of unprecedented scale across the Indian Ocean. Ships larger than anything Europe would put to sea for centuries, carrying tens of thousands of men. Somewhere along the East African coast, and via a Bengali intermediary, the fleet acquired a giraffe and brought it home to the Ming court. What happened next was not zoology. Court scholars looked at the animal and identified it as the qilin, a creature from Chinese cosmology that appears only during the reign of a truly virtuous ruler, a hooved, gentle, otherworldly being that arrives as heaven's endorsement. Officials produced paintings and poems. The emperor, to his credit, publicly declined the flattery and said he was no sage, but the political value had already landed, and further giraffes were sought on subsequent voyages. An animal from the African savanna briefly became the confirmation of a Chinese emperor's mandate. Europe caught up later, and less gracefully. In 1486, the ruler of Florence received a giraffe from the Sultan of Egypt, a calculated gift in a period of intense diplomatic maneuvering. The animal was walked through the streets to genuine public astonishment, taking fruit from windows and balconies as it passed. It was among the first live giraffes seen in Italy since antiquity, and it made an enormous impression on a city that considered itself the center of the world. It also died within months, having caught its head on a beam in a stable that was never built for it. That was the pattern almost everywhere. The animals arrived as wonders and did not last, and the record of European giraffe keeping for centuries is mostly a record of dead giraffes and disappointed hosts, which makes the one that survived so remarkable. In 1826, the ruler of Egypt sent a young giraffe to the French king as part of a bid for political support. She crossed the Mediterranean in a boat with a hole cut in the deck so her neck could rise through it. She landed at Marseille, and rather than risk a carriage, her keepers walked her 880 kilometres north through France over 6 weeks in a custom oilskin coat, accompanied by cows for milk and a small entourage of handlers. Crowds gathered in every town. By the time she reached the capital, tens of thousands of people came to see her in the first months alone. Women wore their hair piled high in a style named for her. Fabric patterns, crockery, wallpaper and furniture all carried her spots. She lived, in the end, for 18 years in Paris, the first giraffe most of France ever laid eyes on, and the animal that turned the species from a curiosity into a public obsession. Britain and Austria imported their own around the same period, with mixed and mostly poor results. But the door was open. By the later 19th century, the giraffe was a fixture of the new public zoological gardens, and for the first time, large numbers of ordinary people, not rulers, not courts, could stand underneath one. And that is roughly when the argument started, the one that has never been settled. The obvious question is why the neck exists. The earliest well-known scientific answer came from a French naturalist at the turn of the 19th century, who proposed that individual giraffes stretched upward toward high leaves during their lives and passed that acquired length to their offspring. The mechanism was wrong, and it became the textbook example of how not to think about inheritance. Then came the competing explanation from natural selection. Giraffes with slightly longer necks reached food others could not, survived droughts better, and left more descendants. Height as a feeding advantage. That version entered every classroom on Earth and stayed there. It has a problem. During the dry season, when competition for food is fiercest, and the selective pressure should be at its most intense, giraffes often feed at shoulder height, or below, rather than stretching upward. If the neck were purely a feeding tool, they should be using it hardest exactly when they are not. So in the mid-1990s, 2 researchers working in southern Africa proposed a different driver: sexual selection. Bulls fight by clubbing each other with their skulls, and in that contest, neck length and neck mass decide who wins. Males have proportionally heavier, more robust necks than females, and continue developing them long after reaching adult height. Under that model, the neck is not primarily a ladder, it is a weapon, refined by males competing for access to females, with the feeding advantage as a useful side effect. Neither explanation has won. The current position among most researchers is that both pressures probably acted together, and the relative weight of each is still genuinely open, which is worth sitting with. The single most recognizable feature of one of the most recognizable animals alive, and we cannot yet say what it is for. There is one more argument still running, and it is bigger than the neck. For 2.5 centuries, the giraffe has been treated as a single species with a set of regional varieties, subspecies distinguished by coat pattern and geography. Reticulated in the northeast, with sharp white lines dividing deep chestnut plates. Maasai in the east, with ragged vine leaf edges. Southern giraffes, with rounder, blotchier markings. Same animal, different outfits. Then genetic work published in 2016 suggested that is wrong. Analyzing samples from populations across the continent, researchers found separations deep enough to argue for 4 distinct species rather than 1, groups that appear not to have interbred meaningfully for something in the order of 1 million years or more, despite living on the same landmass. The proposal is contested. Other teams have run the numbers differently and come back with fewer divisions. The major conservation authorities have not fully adopted the 4-species framework, and the debate continues in the journals. But the stakes are not academic. If there is 1 giraffe species with healthy overall numbers, the picture looks manageable. If there are 4, then several of them are small, isolated, and in far worse condition than the headline figure suggests, and the conservation status of each has to be recalculated from scratch. The same animals, counted 2 different ways, produce 2 entirely different emergencies. Meanwhile, the smaller strangenesses, giraffes have a smell, and it is not subtle. Their coats carry compounds, including indole and scatol, the same molecules that give feces their odor, alongside several with genuine antimicrobial and antiparasitic properties. Bulls smell considerably stronger than cows. The working explanation is chemical defense, a coat that discourages ticks, fungi, and skin parasites in an animal that cannot easily reach most of its own body. Field researchers report being able to smell a giraffe downwind before seeing it. They also do not lie down much, and now you know why the position is so costly. But there is a further wrinkle. A giraffe getting up from the ground goes through a slow, multi-stage maneuver of folding and unfolding limbs that takes several seconds and leaves it entirely committed. In captivity, an adult giraffe that goes down and cannot rise is often in serious trouble because the body is not built to be horizontal for long. Weight that size, pressed against the ground, causes damage on its own. The tail is the longest of any land mammal, around 1 meter of it, tipped with a thick black tuft of coarse hair, used as a fly whisk against biting insects that concentrate on the hindquarters. Those tail hairs have been used across Africa for centuries, woven into bracelets, threaded as beadwork, and used as a fine, extremely strong sewing thread. It is one of the few practical things we have ever taken from the animal, and it comes from the least glamorous end of it. Male social behavior is stranger than the textbooks let on. Same-sex mounting between bulls is common in giraffe populations, and in some studies of some populations, it has been recorded at rates equal to or exceeding male-female mounting. It appears tied to dominance, tension reduction, and social bonding rather than reproduction, and it is entirely routine. It has been documented for decades and simply does not appear in most popular accounts of the species. Then the outliers, the individuals that turn up once and change what we thought the limits were. In 2020, researchers published observations of 2 giraffes that should not exist. One in Namibia, one in Uganda, both adult males, both with normal length necks attached to dramatically shortened legs. They stood around 2.5 to 2.5+ meters, roughly half the height of a typical bull. They had a form of skeletal dysplasia, the same broad category of condition that causes dwarfism in humans and in domestic animals, and they had survived to adulthood in the wild with it, which nobody had recorded before in this species. Both were later reported to be alive on follow-up checks. What is not known is whether they can compete socially at all, because a bull that cannot swing his head down onto a rival's flank from full height has effectively no route to rank. And in 2017, in a conservancy in northern Kenya, rangers documented something that had been the stuff of local rumor: white giraffes. Not albino, leucistic, a condition in which skin cells fail to produce pigment while the eyes remain dark. A female and her calf, pale as chalk against the scrub, photographed and filmed and shared worldwide. A second calf followed. In early 2020, the female and one calf were found dead, poached. Their remains had been in the field for weeks. That left exactly one known white giraffe alive anywhere on Earth. A lone male, the last of the group. Rangers fitted him with a GPS tracking device attached to an ossicone, transmitting his position hourly, so that patrols could stay between him and anyone who came looking. He is, as far as anyone knows, still out there. The rarest large mammal variant on the continent, alive because a satellite is watching him around the clock. Silent is the right word, and not only for the reason the biologists mean it. Think about what has to be true for that to happen. An animal loses nearly a third of its population in the span of a single human career, and the world does not register it. Not because the decline was hidden, the surveys were published, the numbers were available to anyone who went looking, but because nobody was looking. The giraffe fell out of view while standing 6 meters tall in open country. It is possibly the only species on Earth that could manage that, and it happened to the one animal we have the longest, strangest record of caring about. We put it in tribute caravans up the Nile. We paraded it through Rome and did not have a word for it. We sailed it across the Indian Ocean and read it as proof that heaven approved of an emperor. We walked it through Florence so a banking family could make a point, and 880 kilometers across France so a king would feel flattered enough to send guns. We named a constellation after it. We filed it as a deer, then spent 2 more centuries failing to agree on what its neck is for, how many species of it there are, or what it is saying to the others in the dark at 92 hertz. 20 centuries of the most intense, most expensive, most impractical attention we have ever paid to an animal that gave us nothing back. And then, in the last 35 years, we stopped watching. That is the part worth sitting with. Not the numbers on their own, the combination. Everything laid out here is true of an animal currently in decline. The heart pushing blood 2 meters uphill at pressures that would kill you. The net of arteries at the base of the skull, breaking the surge every time the head drops to drink, hundreds of times a day, flawlessly, for 25 years. The 7 bones, the tongue that grew its own sunscreen, the 3 or 4 minutes of real sleep, taken in a curl on the ground, in a position it cannot run from. The mothers standing over calves that will not get up. The friendships that hold for years inside a herd we spent decades calling random because we only watched it for an afternoon. None of that is being conserved by accident. It is a set of solutions that took millions of years to assemble, walking around in a body we have never managed to fully explain, in populations that are thinning while the general public assumes giraffes are fine, because they have always been fine. Because there is one on the wallpaper in every nursery, because the cartoon version is so ubiquitous that the real one reads as a settled fact rather than a living animal with a number attached to it. That familiarity is what did the damage. The elephant got campaigns because ivory made the threat legible. The rhino got armed guards because the horn trade wrote the story for us. The giraffe had no villain simple enough to name, no single trade to ban, no image that fitted on a poster. It just lost ground, quietly, across a continent, in 100 separate places at once, to habitat loss, and land conversion, and conflict, and snares. And the animal that humans once crossed oceans to look at became the animal humans stopped seeing. We do not know why it is that tall. That is still an open question, honestly and genuinely, after all this time. We do not know how many kinds of it exist. We do not fully know what the humming is for. What we do know is the count. Around 117,000 against roughly 400,000 elephants. 3 or 4 of them for every one of these. That figure was not a secret. It was simply never news. 2,000 years ago, a crowd in Rome stopped dead in the street because something impossible walked past them. In a Kenyan conservancy right now, a lone white male is walking around with a tracker on his ossicone, transmitting his position every hour, because the alternative is that he goes the way his mother and sibling went. Same animal, same impulse to look at it. 2,000 years apart, and the difference is that this time we know exactly what we are looking at, and exactly what it would cost to lose it.